Lucifer is not Satan's name. It is a Latin word. A word meaning morning star, lifted from a poem about a dead Babylonian king. And yet, for 1500 years, you have been told they are the same being. They are not. And what the original texts actually say will change how you read both of them forever. This is not a question of minor biblical trivia. If Lucifer and Satan are two different figures, drawn from two different texts in two different centuries, referring to two different things, then the architecture of evil that most of Western Christianity has built rests on a foundation that was never there. I am not here to attack what you believe. I am here to ask whether what you were given is actually what was written. Because there is a difference, and that difference matters. Let us begin with what most people believe. The story, as most of us received it, goes like this. Before the creation of the world, there was an angel, the most beautiful, the most powerful, the most luminous of all heavenly beings. His name was Lucifer, the light-bearer, and in the fullness of his brilliance, he did what the proud always do. He reached for more than he was given. He said, "I will ascend to the heavens. I will raise my throne above the stars of God. I will make myself like the Most High." And for that he fell, cast out of heaven like lightning, stripped of his light, transformed, beautiful to terrible, luminous to dark. From that moment, this fallen being became the adversary of God and all of humanity. He became Satan. This is not an obscure medieval invention. This reading has behind it the weight of Origen, Tertullian, Augustine. It is the framework of Paradise Lost. It is the theology of every Sunday school classroom in the Western world. And it is not without some basis in Scripture. Luke records Jesus saying, "I saw Satan fall like lightning from heaven." Revelation speaks of a war in heaven, a great dragon thrown down, identified as that ancient serpent called the devil or Satan. The tradition is real. The influence is immense. But the origin story, the specific claim that Lucifer was this being's name before his fall, that comes from a single passage. Isaiah chapter 14. And it is not what Isaiah chapter 14 says. Isaiah chapter 14 is not a theological treatise about a cosmic being. It is a taunt. In Hebrew literary tradition, a mashal, a mocking lament, a song of ridicule composed over a fallen enemy. The verses before and after chapter 14 leave no ambiguity. God tells the people of Israel, "When the Lord gives you rest from your pain and turmoil and the harsh service you were made to serve, then you will take up this taunt against the king of Babylon." The king of Babylon. Not a cosmic being, not an angel, a king, a specific historical human king. And within this taunt song, verse 12 reads, in the original Hebrew, Heillel ben Shachar. Heillel, from the root halal, to shine, to gleam, to flash with light. It is not a name. It is a description, the gleaming one, the shining one, the brilliant one. This word appears only once in the entire Hebrew Bible. Once. Ben Shachar, son of the dawn. This is the planet Venus, the morning star, which rises before dawn, blazes brilliantly, and then is swallowed by the light of the rising sun. The imagery is precise. The taunt is precise. You who rose like the morning star, look at where you have fallen. The Babylonian king who imagined ascending to the heights of God has instead descended to Sheol, the underworld, the realm of the dead. And then, 2 verses later, the text removes all remaining doubt. Verse 16. Those who see the fallen king in Sheol look at him and say, "Is this the man who shook the earth? Is this the man who made the world a wilderness?" Aish, the man. The text calls him a man. When the Greek translators rendered Heillel into the Septuagint, they wrote Phosphoros, the light bearer, the morning star, the common Greek term for Venus. When Jerome translated the Septuagint into Latin for the Vulgate in the year 405, he wrote Lucifer, the light-bearer, the morning star, the common Latin term for Venus. Pliny the Elder used this word for the planet. Virgil used it in the Aeneid. Cicero used it. It was ordinary, carried no supernatural weight. It was a word for a star. The moment Lucifer became a name, the name of a being rather than a description of a star, had nothing to do with Isaiah's text. That moment came later, much later, and this is only the beginning of what was changed. You may be thinking of Luke 10, verse 18. Jesus says, "I saw Satan fall like lightning from heaven." Does that not confirm the fall? Does that not confirm that Satan was cast from a celestial realm? It does suggest a fall, but notice what it does not say. It does not say the name Lucifer. It does not reference Isaiah 14. It does not give the fallen being a biography, a name before the fall, a rebellion, a pride-driven catastrophe. That biography was attached to this verse by the church fathers who came later. The verse on its own does not provide it. And then there is the figure in the Hebrew Bible that is actually called Ha-Satan, with the Hebrew article Ha, meaning that figure is not fallen. Open the book of Job, chapter 1. The B'nai Ha-Elohim, the sons of God, present themselves before God in what scholars recognize as a divine council, a heavenly court, and among them is Ha-Satan, the accuser. God speaks to him directly. "Where have you come from?" Ha-Satan answers, "From roaming through the earth and going back and forth in it." God asks about Job. Ha-Satan proposes the test. This being has access to God's presence. He is not banished. He is not at war with God. He operates entirely within God's permission. In the 3rd chapter of Zechariah, Ha-Satan appears again, this time as a prosecuting attorney opposing Joshua the high priest. God rebukes Ha-Satan, which only makes sense if Ha-Satan is a subordinate doing his appointed task, not an independent cosmic rebel immune to God's authority. The Hebrew article is not a small detail. You do not call a personal name the Satan any more than you would introduce yourself as the Michael or the Gabriel. Ha-Satan is a role, the adversary, the accuser, the one who opposes, who tests, who challenges. In the book of Numbers, a human military official is called Lusatan, an adversary. In 1 Samuel, the Philistine commanders call David a potential Satan, an opponent in battle. The word, in the Hebrew Bible, does not carry the weight of a name, carries the weight of a function. And that function is not the same as the gleaming morning star of Isaiah's taunt song. But there is something stranger still. The same term that became the name of Christianity's cosmic enemy, the morning star, the light-bearer, was used by another writer in a very different direction. In Revelation, chapter 22, verse 16, Jesus speaks, "I, Jesus, have sent my angel to give you this testimony for the churches. I am the root and offspring of David, and the bright morning star." The bright morning star, the same image, the same celestial metaphor. In 2 Peter, chapter 1, verse 19, the writer promises that the coming of Christ is like the morning star rising in your hearts. The Greek word used, phosphoros. The identical Greek word the Septuagint used for Heillel in Isaiah 14. The same metaphor that Jerome would later render as Lucifer. Think about what that means. The title morning star, the very image that was applied to a fallen Babylonian king, and later interpreted as the pre-fall name of a cosmic adversary, was also applied directly to Jesus. The early church was not confused about this. They were doing something deliberate. They were reclaiming the image of the morning star, saying, the true light-bearer, the true Lucifer in the Latin sense of the word, is not a fallen king. It is not a rebel angel. It is this That reclamation was then obscured by the very theological synthesis that turned Isaiah's Babylonian taunt into Satan's origin story. And the synthesis was not an organic reading of the text. It was constructed. Origen of Alexandria, one of the greatest and most influential theologians of the early church, was among the first to explicitly connect Isaiah 14 to a pre-creation fall of Satan. This was around the year 220 CE, 600 years after Isaiah wrote his taunt song, almost 7 centuries after the fall of Babylon. Tertullian followed, Augustine consolidated, and by the 5th century, what had been a Latin poet's word for Venus had become the proper name of the great adversary of God. And then in 1667, John Milton published Paradise Lost. And whatever the theologians had built in the first 4 centuries, Milton finished. Satan is magnificent, tortured, eloquent, the character who says, "Better to reign in hell than serve in heaven." This Satan has a biography, a personality, a fall that reads like the most dramatic scene in literature. He is almost certainly the Satan most English-speaking people carry in their imagination. Not the Ha-Satan of Job, not the Heillel of Isaiah. Milton's Satan. And once you see this, once you trace the thread from Heillel to Jerome's Lucifer to Origen's synthesis to Milton's poem, you cannot unsee it. Why did this happen? Why did the church, brilliant, careful theologians who knew their Hebrew, who knew their Greek, why did they take 2 separate figures from 2 separate centuries and merge them? Because the merged figure did something that the separate figures could not. It answered a question. The question that every tradition, every philosophy, every human being who has ever suffered eventually asks. Where does evil come from? Ha-Satan of Job, the accuser who operates within God's permission, is a deeply uncomfortable answer to that question. It suggests that adversity, testing, suffering are not foreign intrusions into God's order. They are part of it. The gleaming king of Isaiah, brought low by his own pride, is a taunt about human arrogance. It says nothing about the cosmic origin of evil, but a rebel angel, a beautiful being who chose himself over God, who was cast from heaven, who became the architect of all human suffering. That is an origin story. And origin stories are what humans need. The psychologist Ernest Becker, in his book The Denial of Death, observed that humans cannot live without meaning, and that meaning requires coherence. A narrative with a beginning, a crisis, and the possibility of resolution. The Lucifer-Satan synthesis provided exactly that architecture for the problem of evil. This is what happens whenever institutions inherit mystery. They shrink it to fit the room. The mystery of evil, where it came from, why it exists, what it is one of the oldest and hardest questions in human thought. And the Lucifer-Satan synthesis gave a clear, pictorial, dramatic answer, at the cost of what the texts actually said. And here is what I find most striking. The original texts, the Ha-Satan of Job, the Heillel of Isaiah, are not simpler than the synthesis. They are stranger. A cosmic adversary who serves God's court rather than opposing it, who cannot move without divine permission, who tests human beings as part of the divine order, is a more demanding theology than a rebel angel who simply went bad. It asks more of the believer. It refuses easy answers about where suffering comes from. It says, the adversarial is not an intrusion. It is woven in. That is harder to preach, but it may be closer to the truth the texts were trying to carry. I want to ask you something in the comments. Which Satan do you actually believe in after today? The one the text describes, a prosecutorial figure, subordinate, permitted, operating within God's order. Or the one tradition created, the rebel, the light-bearer, the ancient beautiful enemy. Because those are not the same answer, and I want to know which one you are leaving this video with. If you found value in this, consider subscribing. Not for the numbers, but because the next question is even harder, and you may want to be there when we open it. Take care of yourselves and each other. From dust we came, and to dust we shall return.